This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm NIzzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for NIzzanotes, a weekly vlog series I do where I talk about Limited. Right now we're talking about Crimson Vow Limited, and in this video I want to do a couple things. First, I want to talk about how to approach this new format in terms of, it's a Prince format as people are calling it. That's a term that means, that there are more ultra powerful rares than there usually are, and those determine the outcome of your drafts more often than they do in a typical format. And I agree with the idea that this is a Prince format, so I want to talk about a few things about how one should approach such a format, maybe a little bit differently than they would a completely normal one. So that's one thing we're going to do. And the second thing is I'm going to talk about 5 cards that I think have underperformed so far in this format, cards that have been a bit disappointing. We'll also, of course, do a crack-a-pack at the end. So to start with, let's talk about this format as a Prince format. So, as I just said, a Prince format is one where there are really powerful rares, more than there usually are. And, this format has like 30 or 35 bombs in it. The typical set has between like 10 and 20. So that is a significant difference. And it does mean that opening really powerful rares can play an even greater role than normal in your draft. There's just a lot of cards that are really, really good. Some of them are pretty much unbeatable, but a lot of them can still be killed. But they're hard to kill, and if you don't kill them, they take over the game. So, because you'll be playing so many opponents who have super powerful creatures, it's even more important than normal that you have really good removal. And it doesn't even have to be really good, it just has to be unconditional. A lot of the bombs are expensive, so even if the card's not the most efficient of removal, it's still a playable card, and more playable than it normally would be, because it can kill anything. And, the few examples I want to talk about at common that are important commons, that can really help deal with this problem for you are Bleed Dry. So this one is premium. This one's great. I think it may be the best common in the set because of this format being a Prince format. It kills everything, almost everything. There's, the Hexproof Werewolf, but it kills almost everything and it exiles it. And a lot of these really powerful cards have things they can do from the graveyard. You don't have to worry about that at all. Bleed Dry will get rid of the thing entirely. Doesn't matter if it can become indestructible, as a few cards in the set can. None of that stuff matters. That thing is dead and it's going to exile as long as you can target it. So it's a very real overperformer, I think. It's not a card I had in last week's video, but I do think it's an overperformer because a card like it, there aren't a lot of them in the format at common. You don't have access to nearly as much really powerful removal that just answers everything in this format that we do in most. And for that reason, it's extra good. And this is a format where, because there's not that much removal, these bombs can take over games even more easily. But if you can pick up a couple of Bleed Dries if you're in black, that can really make you feel sort of secure. You're like, okay, I can deal with anything. Even if they play one of the most powerful bombs in the set, I can probably deal with it. White has one of these cards too, Fierce Retribution. It can kill a tapped creature, which isn't the unconditional side, but it can kill a lot of these bombs outright. And later in the game, you can just pay 6 to kill a thing, and it is unconditional at that point, even if it isn't efficient. Grisly Ritual, another black card. Like, this would be a mediocre removal spells in a lot of formats, and it kind of is. If you have Bleed Dries, you don't really need it. But a card like Grisly Ritual and a card like Fierce Retribution, making sure you have at least one of those in your deck is crucial. And that's kind of a problem because not all the color pairs have access at common to these really unconditional removal spells. In fact, I'll be talking, when I talk about underperformers, I'll be talking about why some of these other removal spells aren't so good in a format like this one. But these are 3 commons that are important. You need to make sure you have good removal. You need to value it even more highly than normal in a format where there's so many cards that you're going to regularly see that will just kill you if you can't do anything about it. So especially Grisly Ritual and Fierce Retribution, these 2 cards are better than they look in a format with all of these bombs in it. Bleed Dry is about as good as it looks and maybe even a little bit better. Another thing to keep in mind, we've talked so far about one thing you can do to try to counteract your opponent's powerful bombs. Something else you can do during your own draft to make sure you can play as many powerful bombs as possible is make sure you pick up fixing. Green has access to good fixing in the set without really trying. None of the other colors really do, but there are a few cards that they're kind of overperformers. They're things you should value a little more highly in a set with all of these bombs. And there's a lot of these bombs that you should just be taking even if you don't already have the fixing to splash them. At least that's true, I'd say, throughout Pack 1 and Pack 2. Taking big bombs, even if it doesn't look like you're going to be able to splash them, is a good idea because that's how powerful they are. It gets a little sketchier in Pack 3 because you don't know what you're going to get in terms of fixing that late. But Evolving Wilds, Foreboding Statue, and Honored Heirloom are all things that are pretty nice in this format, better than they look because of all of the bombs, and you want to play as many of them as you can in your deck. Wild and Statue are definitely the better of the two. These are the two you should prioritize significantly higher. Honored Heirloom is sort of the fail case fixing that you'll take if you really need to splash something powerful. And the last thing you can do is try to get under a lot of the bombs in this format. There are some cheap ones, unfortunately. Not that many 3-mana ones, but 4 or 5-mana bombs are a thing in this set. So getting in under those decks isn't always going to be easy, but most of the bombs are more expensive. They'll win your opponent the game in the later part of the game. So say you don't end up with, it doesn't look like you're going to have any bombs, you should consider going as aggressive as you possibly can, because that may enable you to beat your opponent before they can play one of their bombs. And that's even truer if you also don't have the removal. So this is sort of like the fail case situation. You didn't get access to good removal, and you also didn't get any bombs or fixing to play bombs that you did get. Then what you got to do is just try to be as fast as possible, try to kill your opponent before they can play their bomb. Now, that's a big ask in this format, I think. There's so much life gain, especially in black and white, and I don't just mean the black-white color pair. I mean black and white individually have a bunch of life gain that makes that harder. So this is sort of the thing you don't want to end up doing. Like, you're going to have a lower win percentage if this is what you end up having to do, but it's what you have to do sometimes. So yeah, those are the things you can do to sort of compensate for this format being a Prince format. Value unconditional removal, even if it's not the most efficient, even more highly than you ever would. Bleed Dry is way better than it looks because it can deal with everything, almost everything in the format. And picking up fixing is more important than normal because of, opening up off-color bombs and stuff like that. And then if you don't end up with any of your own bombs or really great removal to counteract your opponents, you can be in a really, really aggressive deck, which often means like red-white. All right, so now let's move to talking about some underperformers in the format, and some of these are going to be related to things I just said. Some of them won't be. So the first underperformer I want to talk about, and again, these are cards that I had higher expectations for and they haven't lived up to. The first of these I want to talk about is Estwald Shieldbreaker. This card to me looked like it would be really nice in white aggressive decks. It hits really hard. It's very hard to block. It can become indestructible. And I'm not saying it's bad. You do play it in those decks sometimes. It's good at training and stuff like that, training your smaller creatures. But the big problem this card has is that it dies to so much that costs way less than 4 mana. You have Flame Blessed Bolt. You have that Vampire Aura that gives it -2/-2. And it even dies to Blessed Light, which isn't exactly a great card, but it does die to that as well. Those are all commons. And your opponent, this just ends up dying to a 1-mana card way too often to be as good as I was expecting it to be. It's still a solid playable. I'm not saying this is a card you shouldn't play. That's not really true of any of these cards, but they've all been more disappointing than I expected for a variety of reasons. And for the Shieldbreaker, the main problem is the fact that there are too many cheap spells that can kill it. Next, there's Sigarda's Imprisonment. So I was talking about how great unconditional removal is. Getting rid of a powerful creature from the board entirely is great. Sigarda's Imprisonment is that in the extreme late game. So it does have that usefulness in the extreme late game. But in the early part of the game, it is not a very good card for the most part. We've seen these cards a lot, and it used to be that pacifism effects were just premium removal, but the last couple of sets, it just hasn't been true. There's a couple of things going on in this set that makes this card less than premium. I gave it a B- in my set review because I was like, maybe this aura will work out this time, but it's more like a C. It's a solid playable. You'll play it in your white decks. It has enchantment synergy. Those things are good. But what makes it not really work out, there are a couple of things. First, there's Exploit. Anytime your opponent can cash in the thing you put this on and actually get value out of it, you're in horrible shape. Your opponent still got a full card of value in most cases out of the thing you put this on, which is basically a 2-for-1. You end up in a worse situation than you would have been otherwise. And the other thing is that the bombs in this format, sure, this can shut down some of them, but the vast majority of them have static abilities, have activated abilities. They have a big impact on the board when they enter the battlefield. And so putting this on one of these powerful bombs in this Prince format doesn't feel that great. And again, in the late game, it can get rid of things. You can sort of, if you don't get a hold of Fierce Retribution, Sigarda's Imprisonment is kind of an okay alternative. But having to spend all that mana, you spend 8 total mana to get rid of a creature in the end, which is far from efficient. You do get a blood token, but it's still not that impressive. It's just not that efficient at permanently getting rid of things. Hard to want to spend that mana on late because you're not adding to your board when you do it. And it doesn't deal with, exploit effectively. And it also doesn't do a good job against bombs for the most part. And that's what's made it more of a solid playable and less of a premium removal spell. Next up, I've got Gutter Skulker. This is a card that I thought was going to be like a premium uncommon for blue decks, especially blue-white decks. And it certainly hasn't been bad or even average. It's an above-average card, but it hasn't been quite as good as I expected. It just turns out it's a little clunky. As a 4-mana 3/3, there are board states where it can really pressure your opponent and be great, but there's a lot of board states too where the fact it's so inefficient is a problem because it can't block effectively, and sometimes that's what you need. It also dies to various things in the set that cost less than it does. The fact it comes back from the graveyard later and gives that unblockable ability to something else is nice, but I've found myself in situations where I just don't have the time or the luxury to be doing that, and it doesn't attack that effectively in the meantime. Now, again, this is an above average card. You'll still play it in virtually every blue deck. It's just not this sort of premium uncommon you want to take really highly that I expected. Next up, there's Fear of Death. This is another aura-based removal spell. It has a lot of the same problems as Sigarda's Imprisonment, but in most ways, it's even worse. It can't ever permanently get rid of a bomb creature. It can only shrink its power. That creature still has its toughness, which means it can still block forever, and it still has all of its, value that it got from all of the other things that it has going on, whether it's a static ability or activated ability or whatever. And then, of course, it has the exploit problem. And it's not a bad card. It's like Sigarda's Imprisonment. You play it a decent amount, especially if you're interested in the mill side of the card. But that is also another reason why this hasn't been really lived up to expectations. And I didn't think it was going to be great. I think I gave it a C in my set review. I think it's worse than that. But part of the reason it hasn't lived up to expectations is that the self-mill decks in this format aren't that great. They just haven't panned out that well. It is an enchantment for the blue-white deck, and that gives it some extra value, just like Sigarda's Imprisonment does. So it's got stuff going on. You play it a significant chunk of the time, but you'll find yourself cutting it a lot too. And the last card I want to look at is Skulking Killer, the second Skulk creature with Skulk in its name to make the list. This is another card I didn't think was going to be that good because it has bad base stats as a 4-mana 4/2, which is just abysmal. And its ability didn't seem like it would trigger often enough to me that I would want it. And in my set review, I think I gave it a C because I was like, the upside when you do trigger it will feel really good. But the more I've seen this card, the more I've thought about this card, the more I've seen it in packs and not even remotely wanted it, it's become clear that it is worse than that. It's kind of close to unplayable. If you need a bunch of vampires, it does get a little better because it happens to be one. And if you have a bunch of removal, it gets a little better. But the fact that first, your opponent can only have one creature, and second, the creature has to be small or it can't kill it, is rough. If you compare this to a lot of other cards with enter the battlefield abilities that let you kill a thing, it's just so much worse than the other things we've seen. And yeah, I think, like I said, I gave this a C in my set review. It's a D at best. And so far, I haven't wanted to play it at all. And when I've seen people play it, it's just been a 4-mana 4/2, which isn't something you want. All right, so those are some underperformers from Crimson Vow Limited, some cards that have been disappointing compared to what I expected from them. Let's now do a crack-a-pack where we'll open up a pack, I'll look at it, talk about each of the cards in it, and tell you what I would first pick. All right, so here's the pack. Our first common is Fearful Villager. This guy has been a decent little aggro creature as a 3-mana 2/3 with Menace, and then in the, it can become an even bigger creature with Menace later. It's a fine card, solid for especially the red-white deck. don't see myself playing it that much. I guess you play it in red-green too, but it's not really like the card you're after. You definitely don't want to take it early. You can pick one up in the back half of a pack really easily. Adamant Will, this is a nice little trick if you're in a really aggressive deck, and red-white is usually where I've found myself or seen people playing it. It can blink removal, which is nice because of the indestructibility, although not bleed dry, which we just talked about, which is another reason to like bleed dry. Yeah, it's just a nice trick. You'll play it in your really aggressive decks, but it is a trick, has all the downsides they always have. There's a 2-for-1 risk, there's situational, and so forth. Abrade is next. This thing's great. There are a couple of artifacts you see somewhat regularly in the format. It can blow them up. Most of the time, you're doing 3 damage for 2 mana at instant speed, and that's great. Right now, this would be our pick. It's premium removal. It's one of the better commons in the set. It's definitely what I'm interested in so far. Next up, we've got Flourishing Hunter. This is a nice card, for this format, and we've seen a lot of these 6 mana big creatures that gain you life or whatever when they come into play. And they've panned out pretty well. It's a card that can help you get to your bombs in the later part of the game just because it has a big body and it gains you that life, which is going to be hard for your opponent to quickly kill you once you play it. You definitely don't take it over Abrade, though, but having one in most of your green decks is pretty legit. I'm pretty happy with the first one, but I would take Abrade over it. We've got Bleed Dry here, one of the cards we talked about as being important, extra important in this format, and I would take it over Abrade. It's less efficient, and that matters, but it's crazy because like Hero's Downfall costs 1 less mana. It can kill Planeswalkers too, but I actually think Bleed Dry is better at 4 mana because it's so much even more unconditional because it exiles these creatures that have graveyard stuff. It works against indestructibility. I've been happier with Bleed Dry than Hero's Downfall, and that's a weird thing in most formats, but this format has enough scary bombs that having a card that kills it and kills it permanently is a big deal compared to Hero's Downfall, which is also great, by the way. When I was talking about the removal spells earlier in this video, I was just looking at a few common ones that are notable for being extra good in this format. So right now I'd take Bleed Dry over Abrade. The artifact upside on Abrade isn't enough to overtake Bleed Dry's ability to deal with basically everything. Lightning Wolf is fine. You'll play it sometimes in your aggro decks, red, green, red, white. It's not a great card. You'll also cut it a lot. Definitely not something we want here. Next, there's Cradle of Safety. This is an interesting card. You can use it as something to protect a bomb, which is nice, but it is situational. It's an enchantment. Blue-white cares about that, but you play it less. You don't play it very often, in my experience. You play it sometimes in really specific decks, but it's definitely not something you take early. Skywarp Scob has been solid. This is another card that can sort of stabilize you like Flourishing Hunter can and help you get to your bombs just because of its big body, and it'll usually, somewhat regularly at least, actually draw you the card, which is nice. Militia Rallier, nice little aggro creature. I've been happy with it in green-white and red-white especially, but certainly not something you take early. We've got Fierce Retribution here, another card we talked about when I was talking about the various common removal spells that are extra good in this format. Fierce Retribution is one of them, but it's way worse than Bleed Dry. It does the same thing as Bleed Dry basically once you get to 6 mana, and even then it's not quite as catch-all as Bleed Dry is. So we're still on Bleed Dry. We've got Wedding Security next. Wedding Security is really good. It's a nice blood payoff, draws you cards, gets bigger. It's just been really nice in black-red decks. And I do think it's first pickable in some packs, but in a pack that has Bleed Dry, that's not true. Okay, our next uncommon's Angelic Quartermaster. Back-to-back really strong uncommons. This one can come down and put counters places. And this is where things get interesting. I think in most formats, you take a card like the Quartermaster over Bleed Dry. I'm not sure I would in this format. Bleed Dry's ability to deal with all of these scary bombs is really great. And while Angelic Quartermaster is pretty impressive, it's powerful for sure, and it leaves value behind no matter what. Stuff like that. It's great, but I think I'm still on Bleed Dry. It's close. I like the Quartermaster a lot. It's definitely the second best card so far, but I think I'm still on Bleed Dry. We've got another really good uncommon next, Infestation Expert, the one that cranks out, insect tokens when it enters and attacks and makes even more of them once it transforms. I would still take both Bleed Dry and Angelic Quartermaster over the Expert. Yeah. Okay, well, our rare, we got a good rare too. This has been a strong pack in general. We've got Welcoming Vampire as our rare, and I would be happy taking all 3 uncommons in this set. All 3 uncommons in this pack. The rare in this pack Abrade, and Bleed Dry, I'd be happy first picking any of those. So this is a very strong pack with 6 cards that are potentially first pickable. And then you have, Fierce Retribution and Skywarp Scob sort of, and Flourishing Hunter, next on the list. But yeah, so Welcoming Vampire, this is a great card. It's a value engine, and I do value value engines more than I value something like Bleed Dry. It's not that hard to end up in a deck that has lots of cards that draw you cards with Welcoming Vampire. It'll just happen if you're in white, and it's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer, which is a great rate and limited anyway. So it draws you a bunch of cards, and I do think that is something that's better than Bleed Dry. And I also think the Vampire is better than the Quartermaster. You just don't have to try that hard to build around, it at all. And it just does its thing. I mean, I've won plenty of games thanks to Welcoming Vampire. I've lost games because of it. If you can't deal with it, it wins. It's not quite a bomb on the same scale as many of the rares and mythics in this set are, because it doesn't sort of single-handedly do it for you. It sort of slowly grinds out the value to win you the game. But it's still a card that if your opponent doesn't kill it, it's probably just going to win you the game, because you have so many creatures that will trigger it, and turning all of your 2-power creatures into cantrips is insane. So yeah, this is a strong pack. I would take the Vampire, followed by Bleed Dry, followed by the Quartermaster, and like I said, all 3 of those would make me pretty happy. I think I would take Abrade ahead of the Expert or Wedding Security. I may have left that out when I was sort of ranking them earlier, but yeah, so I think it actually goes Welcoming Vampire, Bleed Dry, Quartermaster, Abrade. I think that's the order I would take cards here. Very strong pack, so it's an interesting one to think about the picks. I wouldn't fault anyone for going with the Quartermaster or Abrade over Bleed Dry. Right now, though, I feel like Bleed Dry is the better card. All right, so that does it for this edition of NIzzanotes. I'll be back next week to talk some more Crimson Vow. Might be taking a look at the archetypes. I sort of see what I want to talk about. I don't know ahead of time necessarily, but I will at some point be doing a video ranking the archetypes in this set, and that might be next week. We may end up talking about something else. We'll have to see. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future NIzzanotes, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. More than half of my viewers are unsubscribed, so it'd be a big help if you would subscribe. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.